Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Alicia Allen. I am the program coordinator for TCU's Alcohol and Drug Education department. We're going to get started in maybe about 1 or 2 minutes just to make sure we get everybody in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I hope everyone's having a great Labor Day weekend. I want to say thank you for joining us today on your Monday. So at the bottom of the screen, you are going to have the capability to ask questions, and I encourage you to do that at any time during the session. At the very end, I am going to provide a link for a survey. If you have time, can you please fill that out? It would be very helpful, okay?
Okay, so am I live now?
Oh, I was gonna read your bio.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll wait until I hear the cue. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, you're totally fine. Okay, so this is Dr. Rob Turrisi. He is currently a professor at Penn State University with a joint appointment in the Department of Biobehavioral Health and Prevention Research Center. Dr. Turrisi is also the director of the Prevention Research to Optimize Health Lab. Turrisi's work focuses on developing and evaluating parent and individual level prevention efforts to reduce alcohol abuse and alcohol-related consequences for adolescents, college students, and emerging adults. His prevention research has been supported by funds from the National Institutes of Health, National Institutes of Health, National Institutes on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, National Institute on Drug Abuse, and the National Cancer Institute for over 30 years. Turrisi is also the author of a parent handbook for talking with students about alcohol. The parent handbook is still the only evidence-based parent-based intervention that has undergone the rigor of 10 well-controlled clinical trials. So introducing Dr. Robert Turrisi. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I can't wait to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Alicia. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of TCU for taking this strong initiative to be able to make a difference in the young students' lives. That I've been doing this work for since the late 1980s and early 1990s, and I've done it all over the country. And it's really people like Alicia and Lindsay and others at the front lines that are making the difference to really help students. So thank you for you. And thanks for all the mothers and fathers that I'm speaking with today on behalf of your students. I'm going to share with you what the science really suggests are the best practices for us to engage in. And I'm happy to hear back from anybody at any time. So I just want to put that out there. There's a lot of people I can thank, but I want to get to the point because it's a holiday weekend, and some of you will be watching this later in recording, and your time is really precious. So I want to value that. Okay, with that in mind, I'm going to change it so that you could see me and you could see my slides. And I don't know if you could do both. We'll see how that plays out. This is the difference between trying to do these things using technology versus being live. I'd much, much rather be in Texas right now visiting with all of you. All right, so that being the case, let me begin. Okay, so we're gonna start, oh, I don't know that I shared my screen. That's not very useful. I do this all the time. You wouldn't realize that from what I just did, but I am. All right, so I am sharing now, and I will play this. here. Okay, so the title of my talk is Engaging Parents in Alcohol and Other Drug Prevention. I'm going to talk a little bit about what parents can do. And I'm going to start from the outset by being a little bit humble about what I know and what I don't know. And I'll make the difference between the associations between what I think when I'm talking and what the data show. And then what I'll do there is I'll say something like, I think, or my opinion is, or what I feel I think we should do. That's my thoughts based on all of my experiences and my understanding of the science. Other times I'll say the data show or studies show, and then you know it's specifically from the science that's out there as opposed to my opinion about that science. I think that's important to get out in front. Okay, with that in mind, this is kind of a portrait of college students, and this is where I started my career, where students were engaged in heavy consumption. This doesn't represent a specific campus, but rather campus is a cross-section of campus throughout the country. And as I was doing this work, I really was doing more work on adolescents and middle school students and prevention type of mold. And as I was doing that, I was being a typical science. I was looking at why do people do what they do? How do we change that? I was taking those things and trying to learn about contributing to the science that we know. And I was publishing those in all the top medical and substance abuse journals. And as that came along, I was also asked to help in a big national study of cancer prevention work. And I started getting involved in those two. And each of these tried to play themselves against each other so that I would learn some things from the substance use and misuse fields, and then I would learn some things from the cancer prevention fields. And then I would try and merge these two things to try and say, okay, what do we learn from both of these to make a difference that way? The common link here was that everything that we were doing was evidence-based. And it all was structured around trying to understand what are the best practices. The next thing is everything that we wanted to do intervention-wise was going to be brief. And when I say brief, I'm talking about maybe 15, 20 minutes. So I'm trying to make a big difference in about 15, 20 minutes in many people's lives. And I'm also trying to do this on a national level. No small undertaking on our level. So while I was doing this with adolescents in the cancer trials, I decided, I was a college professor, I had students that were coming into my office all the time, and they were trying to tell me that they couldn't go on to graduate schools, they couldn't go on to law schools, they couldn't go on to medical schools, in large part because of the behaviors they engaged in when they first showed up on campus. And one thing all the studies show, and again, I'm talking about studies now, not my opinion, all the studies show that there's an increase in drinking from high school to college. So in that 3 to 4 month window between when they graduate from high school and when they go to college, things change in their lives. They drink more, they experience more consequences and different consequences than they may have experienced when they were in high school. So the experience of the typical mother and father does not translate to the experience of me, the professor that has students in my classes all the time. So when I say things like to parents, that the typical student drinks between 6 to 10 drinks when they go out on a Friday or Saturday night, that's not something that typical parent would experience from their son or daughter. They'd say things like, well, they seem very mature. I don't think they're interested in that sort of thing, and so on, because that is what they observe. My observations on the internet are completely different than that. I observe heavier drinking. I observe drinking combined with other drugs to get a different type of high. I observe consequences that parents would not have experienced before. Like typically, and I'm not like putting a list together to scare any parents, but students blacking out from their drinking and substance misuse so that their brain is now shifting its focus from forming memories, making good choices, to breathing and heart rate. Then it switches its operations. And so they would black out. So the brain would still be behaving, the person would still be awake, but the next day they would know nothing because no memories are formed of that experience. So they might do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. They might show up and wake up at a different place and they have no idea how they got there, why they're waking up in this other strange place. Typical parent that would see this in high school would jump on this right away, but they may not be observing this because now their son or daughter are living someplace else, okay? This is why it's so important what TCU has done. First off, implementing the parent handbook materials that I'll talk more about later, but also having me come and talk to you to share some of these experiences. So there's a couple of things that have caught my attention recently that make me even more concerned, if there's a way to be more concerned about this. So I mentioned that there's a jump from high school to college. That's my hand like looking like it's a graph. So there's a big increase from drinking from high school to college. And there's an increase in the type of consequences that are going on. Consequences tend to be much more severe if they experience them. The two things that have caught my attention in recent years based on studies that we've done and other people in the field have done is that whatever the students increase to from high school to college in that first year, that high watermark, that tends to be what they typically then do throughout college. So they continue to drink at a high level, they continue to experience these consequences, and despite experiencing them, it doesn't motivate them to change and reduce their drinking. So these interventions that we're going to talk a little bit about, including the parent handbook, are trying to disrupt that increase and disrupt the change by including you as parents in that process. So I started working with college students, and my colleagues at that point said, college students don't listen to their parents anymore. Remember, this is 30 years ago. They say things like their friends are everything, their peers are everything. The students' parents, they're not going to listen to them anymore. You're crazy for wanting to do that. You got a good career going. You sure you want to do this? And so I fast forward 30 years from those early days when I started doing this work. And I get 256 million hits on college student drinking. That's typically around the number. That's a lot of hits. 52 million are on prevention. So the other 204 million are on drinking experiences and things that are going on. 52 million of those are on prevention. And by the way, I didn't count that. I just typed in college student drinking prevention as opposed to college student drinking, which is up from 35 million just a few years ago. So you're seeing more and more schools taking on prevention efforts. And 59 million hits on parent-based college drinking interventions, which is up from 5 million just a few years ago and 0 when I started doing work in the mid-90s. Now, I will have to qualify. The reason why it was 0 in the mid-90s, Google didn't exist. But I knew it was 0 because there wasn't anything in the literature, and everybody I talked to said it was a ridiculous idea at that time. So 15 years clinical trials with parents show that parents do matter. It's never too late. And that's what the data is going to show. So I'm showing 8 of these trials. We've done close to 15 of these now. And some of these have been done by colleagues of mine that I've done training with and replications and so on. But a lot of them include multiple sites, so it's not college specific. A lot of them focus on high-risk populations, not just general college students, but they also sometimes just work with regular college students. Some combine multiple sites with different types of high-risk populations, and some do things. We ask questions like, will parents do it, and will it work? Will parents do it, and will it work? So we've done it more than once because we want to see our data replicated so we have confidence that it really makes a difference. Will the PBI change culture in high-risk environments? And the PBI stands for parent-based intervention. So that's the parent handbook, kind of like everybody will get a copy of that. Alicia, correct? Everybody's going to get a copy at some point? Yeah, okay, great. Will it decrease consequences? Will it make transitions between different profiles of drinkers? And I'm going to talk about these things as time goes on. I just want to point out that this has a very, very heavy scientific base. And it's not specific just to the United States. The things I'll talk about today are in the United States. However, I will talk about our neighboring countries and communities that happen in Australia and also in Europe, so that we could see where we stand in relation to those programs. Okay, so high-risk drinking in youth. First off, alcohol is ubiquitous, and that means it's everywhere we look. So it's in the South, it's in the North, it's in the central part of our country, it's in the Northwest, it's in the Southeast, it's in the Southwest, it's everywhere. It's not a specific place. And everywhere we find young people right now, we will find young people probably engaged in this type of behavior. Peers. Peers are the most important influence on drinking and availability. And there are numerous studies. These are just some of them talking about these photos just reflect a little bit of that. The second issue that comes into play that really makes a difference are elevated availability and increased opportunities to drink in a high-risk manner. These are part of the reasons why students drink more from high school to college. Because students might have gone to high school parties, but it might be only one party in town that whole night. Whereas with college, you can't walk down the street and run across multiple parties going on all times. In fact, many students will go to many parties in a given evening. And that will happen on more than one night. And so it's not just, hey, the Saturday night, like in high school. Even from people in larger communities and larger cities, in our cities, it's not the same. It's nowhere near the same. The environment at colleges and universities is much greater because not only do you have college students at most of these parties, you have non-college students at these parties and people of same age from the military. In other words, where I live in State College, Pennsylvania, or Penn State is, it is the only show in town for hundreds of miles. It is the place where everybody goes to on weekends. At TCU, you're in the heart of the largest, most populated areas of Texas. And so it's not uncommon with the number of different colleges and universities in those communities to just see that connectivity between colleges of different places. Okay. The next thing is, why do youth drink? We've done studies that have looked at the reasons. Why are they drinking? Because this informs the intervention efforts. One of the reasons is their increased willingness to experience the consequences afterwards. In other words, when students drink, there's pros and cons of every behavior that there's risks and benefits of everything they do. And we did studies where we looked at, are they willing to experience the consequences? And we gave them a list of 30-something different consequences. And we found that very few were in the not at all willing. In fact, most of them were in the moderately willing to slightly willing. In other words, they saw experiencing consequences as the price to pay for having a good time when they go out that evening. So consequences are not necessarily a deterrent for most students. The other reason why students drink, reduce social controls. These are photos for parents that are attending college parties on parent visit weekend. This is a photo showing students and parents carrying around what look to be very, very large small cups. This school instituted a 1 cup per person rule, and the students decided to remedy that situation by making the cups the size of small garbage pails. And you see in the lower, I believe it's the right-hand corner, a father is drinking with his son and his friends. Here's another picture of a mother coming to visit on Parents' Weekend that's doing keg stands, where basically alcohol is forced down her throat. I have a colleague that looks at that and says, I cannot believe this mother's doing it. And she says, and she's wearing pink pumps too. Okay, so reduce social controls. Typically after 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the evening in most college towns, at most college areas, the only adults that are around are usually ones that are either first responders or people serving these students alcohol at parties, bars, and other establishments. In other words, there are very few adult social role models. So it's a completely different experience than it is Monday through Friday. It's 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening when there are a lot of adults around. So it's a completely different environment. So peers, availability, and social controls. Those social controls involve parents. While we can't be with our sons and daughters after they go to college at all times, we could set the stage through different actions and communications that we engage in. So I am a scientist. I study brain development and self-regulation. That means taking care of the decisions you make. And I just want to talk about a parent and a child here. Here's a father talking to his son, who's 18 years old, about going and drinking. And his brain shows up as mostly blue with a little bit of green. That shows that the brain is not quite mature. And we know from our data that our 18 to 23-year-olds, our brains are still developing. And the area that develops the last is the area that teaches them how to make good choices and good decisions. For the most part, most young people are making emotionally behavior-based decisions. Here's a mother talking to her daughter. Her daughter's showing a lot of different colors, which means that she's maturing a little bit faster than her son. But there's still quite a bit of blue. And so there's still a lot of emotion that's going on. And so young people, when they're 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, are making mostly emotional decisions like I'm willing to experience consequence to have a good time. Individuals that are older will start making more judgmental decisions. And what I mean by judgmental is they're weighing the pros and cons of their behavior in a different way. They're thinking things through and they're forming better choices. So young people are going to make much more emotional choices. And this is why you see headlines about young people making really bad choices, because the smart ones are not making those types of choices. What we do know is that you cannot rush the biological development. What we also know, though, is the way parents parent can increase the transition from emotion to thoughtful decision making. So parents aren't just sharing values, they're actually sharing how their kids can mature faster. So the next slide shows two different pictures of most of our campuses. The pictures that are on the left are where most of the parents visit when they think about, that's the place I want to send my son and daughter to. The place on the right is what happens after 10 o'clock at night on a Friday and a Saturday weekend evening. And the reality is, again, that's where peers, availability, and reduced social controls are going on. And that's also where we see more of the functioning of the brain, being more based on emotions and pleasure rather than thoughts and decision making. But it's interesting to see these contrasts, because the pictures that's on the left shows young people engaged in healthy, low-risk behaviors, which means that they can do this. So in other words, the connectivity between the emotional centers of the brain and the frontal cortex, where the most thoughtful decisions happen, it's connected, and you could see it when the environment supports it. However, when the environment supports high risk, you can see the opposite. So in other words, while the parents that I talk to say things like, my kid seems to be pretty mature, I don't think that kid's into that type of thing, what they're seeing is they're seeing where the environment is low risk. They're seeing where the peers are low risk. When the environment and the peers change, that's when the brain can't make those adaptations quite as fast and readily. And that's where we see those types of problems occur. So what can we do? Okay, so I'm going to talk about an intervention that TCU is about to roll out to parents. And it's one of those brief interventions that takes about 15, maybe 20 minutes for parents to engage. So it's brief. It doesn't take a lot of time. It's about 20 pages in length, and it looks like this booklet right here. And this is an example from Ithaca College. But this is what's being disseminated throughout the country at different universities, and TCU is one of our neighboring partners. And for that, I am very proud of them. So it's brief, target audience, typical families. It's based upon motivating parents, providing them with the knowledge of what's going on and what to focus on, and then providing them with some skills so they can initiate conversations. They can use communication practices that have been shown to be evidence-based that actually work. And it's based on behavioral decision-making theory. And that is, in every situation, individuals have to make choices. And so to the extent that they have the proper knowledge and the skills to make good choices, they make better choices. That's what the science shows. And it is extremely strong evidence-based. If there's information in these materials, it's based upon studies that either we have done, people we've trained have done, or colleagues we've collaborated with. And based upon that, we've registered these with the government in the National ClinicalTrials.gov, which is one of the, it's like the good housekeeping seal of approval. If you look at intervention, you should see, is it registered in the clinical trials program? If it isn't registered in the clinical trials program, it likely doesn't have evidence that it works. So these have actually 2 different clinical trials. We've added a 3rd one for a recent trial. These materials are also have other seals of approval, if you will. One is a landmark report from the U.S. Surgeon General. And that in that report, they evaluated every intervention that's ever been published in any journal at any point in time. And there were 2 that were shown to be effective at reducing high-risk college student drinking behavior and consequences. One was a program called Basics out of the University of Washington, whose authors are Mary Larimer, Jason Kilmer, and other people. Used to be Alan Marlett, but he's since passed. But the serious top people at the University of Washington do Basics, and they've trained a lot of people using that approach. And motivational enhanced interventions. And the second one is the Parent Handbook. So there's only 2 right now that have earned the Surgeon General's seal of approval for the evidence that is built up, showing them to be efficacious. The other one is the College Aim Matrix at the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And they have a listing of all the interventions that have been there, that have been posted, that have had clinical trials registration. Some are better than others, even with that registration. The registration doesn't mean that it's perfect. It means that it's using evidence-based practices and very rigorous. And the parent interventions in the first tier of interventions, that's considered to be what they consider moderate effectiveness and moderate cost. And it's also been endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics. So Surgeon General, NIAAA, NIH, and the American Academy of Pediatrics and the clinicaltrials.gov. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about why this works. Here's some questions we're going to talk a little bit about. Does it work? Does it work by family, or does it just work for specific families? Why does it work? And does it work in high-risk environments? Does it work with at-risk individuals? And is it effective at changing risk profiles? That means if a person is in a high-risk group because of the behavior that they engage in, could it help them transition out of that? And these are the 6 questions we're going to focus on. So we did this study, and you'll see in the lower, I believe it's the left-hand corner from your screen, the journal where we published our findings. We've published more on this, but this is for what I'm sharing with you, just some of these findings that have occurred. And that journal is called Psychology of Addictive Behaviors. It is the American Psychological Association's premier journal on addictions. And we compared families who received the materials and talked to their sons and daughters versus families that did not receive the materials. So the families were exactly the same in every way, and all the scientific rigor that went on to recruiting them. We recruited them from both the East and the West Coast when they were in high school, and they went all over the Western seaboard mostly, and all over the Eastern seaboard. Some went from the East to the West. So this was a national level sample in the study. So it's very generalizable to almost every university. And we looked at the drinking behavior of students in the fall of their first semester and the spring of the second semester. And I want you to I don't want to, basically teach you a science lesson, but I want you to notice one thing about this graph. The red bars represent the students this is a weekend. The red bars represent students whose parents received the materials, had conversations with them based on the materials. And the gray bars represent the students whose parents didn't have these materials. And we gave these materials to the parents just before school and just the first weeks on campus. And we compared them to the other students at the end of the fall and the end of the spring. And as you can see, the red bars are lower than the gray bars for weekend drinking. The DDQ stands for Daily Drinking Questionnaire, and really looks at the typical number of drinks that somebody's going to drink in a week. In this case, we looked at over a weekend. And so the students that were in what we call the treatment group, the group that the parents got the handbooks, they drank on average about 2 to 2.5 drinks per night. And the other students drank about 4.5 to 5. And again, remember, they have males and females in this study. Females tend to drink on average a little bit less than males. But as you can see, it's almost 50% less. And that the findings extended into the spring. So it really carried over to the first year. They didn't decay, and they did. So that's the first thing, weekend drinking. We looked at the heaviest drinking occasions. Again, the red bars are lower than the gray bars, and it's about 60 to 65% of what's going on. So they drank about 60, 45, 50% less on average. We look at missing school because of drinking. Again, we see the red bars are lower than the gray bars, and this is again in the fall and the spring. We look at smoking. We called it marijuana at the time. Now we call it cannabis to catch all. But what we see is the use of other drugs. So even though the materials were designed to reduce drinking, they also had a secondary effect on other drug use. We also looked at many other consequences, but I just want to highlight some of those, and the pattern just kind of followed itself. And that again was published in that journal, Psychology of Addictive Behavior, if you're really interested in reading more about it. So does it work for different families? And so what we're really looking at is, again, we see that one group, the box to the right, is where parents either get the materials or they don't. And then we look at the drinking tendencies, and we do they change by different families? And we publish these findings in a journal called Alcoholism Clinical and Experimental Research. Again, I don't want this to be a science lesson, but I want to show something. The red line represents 3 different kinds of families. Families that are below average in the communication practices, average in communication, and above average. The yellow line represents those 3 families as well. But the red line are parents that have received the materials and talked to their kids. And so if we look at the AA and we look at the red, we see 1.8 drinks on a Saturday night, less than 2. If we look at the average families in terms of the communication, or typical families, we see 2.5 drinks. And if we look at the below average families that receive the materials, we see 3 drinks. The red line is always lower than the yellow line. If we look at the yellow line, we see for the above average, really good communicators, but they didn't have the material, their kids drink about 4 drinks on a Saturday night. The typical family is about 4.5, and the below average is close to 4 as well. Again, this line represents the worst case scenario for families that get the materials. They're always better no matter what the previous communication is. So suppose you have a family where they're like, we talk to our kids all the time. We're doing a really good job of communicating. Everything's really well, but they don't get the handbook. Their kids will probably drink around 4 drinks on a Saturday night on average. However, take those same family members and give them the materials, that drops down to less than 2. And it drops in every situation. So we observe that for communication for families. We observe that for typical modeling, monitoring, whether parents allow their kids to drink or not drink. So in every situation, we found that no matter what the parents were doing, if they use the materials to guide their communications and behaviors, their kids always drank less, no matter what, and got into fewer consequences. And we published that in Alcoholism Clinical Experimental Research. So 3rd question, why does it work? And for here, what we're really doing is we're looking at the effect of parenting on our drinking and consequence outcomes, but we're looking at it for different reasons why, what we call our immediate target variables. And the next piece of this, and we published this again in that Psychology of Addictive Behaviors. Why does it work? Well, in the materials, the handbook, there's different components or different parts of the materials. So we cover content that teaches parents who are reluctant to talk about alcohol, reasons why they should. That's part of the motivation information. We also talk about how alcohol works in the body. So we provide the scientific information about how it's affecting the body. We also look at physical and psychological effects of drinking. We look about setting limits. We look at about the reasons why teens drink, the reasons why they don't drink, when they drink to get drunk, and so on. So we have content that's specifically covering things that we have found to be related to their attitudes towards drinking activities, their attitudes towards non-drinking activities, expectancies that they feel they'll have from drinking, perceptions of social behavior that they might be able to engage in or not, and so on. So we're looking at content to specifically target different psychological and physiological aspects of the way that their students will act. And the reasons why it works is because the material that's in the parent handbook helps parents change their sons and daughters' attitudes towards drinking activities, making them less positive and less willing, and they change their attitude towards non-drinking alternatives to engage in those behaviors. And the parents are able to change their kids' positive transformation so that they're more likely to engage in positive behavior as opposed to risky behavior. They're more likely to help their social behavior, so they don't need alcohol as a social lubricant to engage in conversations with other people. They help them understand that there are more students that actually don't drink a lot than do drink a lot. So they instead of having them look at role models that represent the minority of students who drink heavy and get in trouble, and so on. So it's affecting these very critical variables that influence whether students drink. What it's really doing here, it's also changing students' self-regulation, which means it's really changing their brain. So remember this slide earlier? It's making the students more likely to be using thoughtful alternatives rather than emotional alternatives. Now, profiles. This is really, really important. This is my fun part of my talk, because now we can talk about different risk behaviors. There are different profiles. Some students, if you just take 2 students and say they both drink about 7 drinks per week, one student might only have 1 drink when they go out. So they drink 7 drinks, but they have 1 and no more, and they set a limit on that night. Another student might save it all up for Saturday night and drink 7 in that night. Well, one student's going to have a higher blood alcohol concentration when they go out than the other student. And simply counting the number of drinks doesn't paint the whole picture. And this is one of the things that our studies have started to do, is they started to look at what happens to different profiles of different types of drinkers. And we've published these data in a number of different journals. And so I'm going to show you some of the profiles we've observed and documented, and then what the parent handbook does with those profiles. So there's 4 different types of student drinkers. There's ones that we call the non-drinkers. And if we assess them on their past month drinking, the past month drunkenness, last 2 weeks, how many times they've binge drank, whether their BACs have exceeded 0.08, whether they drink on weekdays, Thursdays, or weekends, we'll pretty much see them coming up with zeros. They simply don't drink that much. And they make up roughly 20-25% of the students on our campuses. So at TCU, about 20 to 25% of our students are going to fall into that group. The weekend non-binge drinkers, these are students that drink on weekends, but they tend not to get drunk. So when they drink, they're going to drink less than 4 for males and less than 3 for females. And so if we assess them on the same things, what we'll see is mostly they're not binging, they're not having high BACs, they're not drinking on weekdays, they're not drinking on Thursdays. They're drinking on weekends, and rarely do they get drunk, but they do drink, and they're self-regulating, okay? So those are 2 of the profiles that exist out there, and they make up roughly about 40% of the students that are on our campuses. And they are what we consider to be relatively low-risk drinkers. The third group that we have is the weekend binge drinker. They don't drink on weekdays, they don't drink on Thursdays, but they drink on weekends, and when they do, they drink heavily, and they get drunk, and they have high BACs, but they limit it to weekends. And then the last profile are heavy drinkers. They drink pretty much all the time. They have weekday drinking nights, they have weekend drinking nights, they tend to get drunk. So these last 2 are our higher risk individuals. These are the individuals that drink a lot and experience the most consequence on our campus. The heavy drinker and weekend binge drinker, the combined between those range to about 30% of the students that exist on campus on average. It could check up a little bit or it could check down, but that's roughly what we have there. So those are the 4 types of drinkers. Okay, so does the parent handbook, parents talking to their sons and daughters with these materials, change students' profiles? That is, does it move students that are in the heaviest drinking groups into the lighter drinking groups? And what we found and observed is that it does. When parents communicate with their sons and daughters, remember I said it's never too late? It's never too late. I had one parent say to me once after a talk, Dr. Turrisi, this is great science, but that train's left the station. My kid's already drinking. And I say, well, guess what? This is the nice thing about trains. They come back to the station, okay? When they leave, they can come back. Depends upon what you do here. But we've seen that the highest risk heavy drinker transitioned out of that profile if the parents read these materials and talked to their kids. Now remember, these are brief 15-minute interventions that have maximal effects. The weekend binge drinkers transitioned out of that profile as well and moved into the weekend non-binger groups. So we found that if parents use these materials, they can prevent their sons and daughters from transitioning into these high-risk groups, but they could also get them to transition out of these high-risk groups. So I've had parents say to me earlier when we didn't have all these clinical trials and these clinical data, say to me, well, I think my kid's going to be okay. Well, I'm going to make a suggestion here. For all the parents that are out there that think their kids are going to be okay, I sure hope you're right. But if I was a person and I had something as simple as one of these handbooks to spend 15 minutes reading and then having conversations with my son and daughter, I would do more than just make an educated guess. I would use the science and I'd use the data to help me drive this. And as you've seen from what I've shared with you, these are all published studies for everybody to look at, and they've been vetted by the best scientists in the world. And now we know it prevents them from drinking. We know it works for all types of families, not just families that have high-risk kids. We know that why it works, it reduces the things that drive why students drink, but it also helps their brain be able to self-regulate better. And we also know that if kids are already experiencing problems as a result of their drinking, or they're at risk, it can move them out of risk. So for me, I say most parents have 15 minutes to help their kids. So parenting and consequences. This is another important thing about profiles. We've seen this one group we call the MRC group, and it doesn't really stand for anything but multiple and repeated consequences. So there's a group of young students out there that experience a lot of consequences, and they do it repeatedly. About 20% of those drinkers experience actually 50% of all the problems. So you take 20% of the students at TCU, there's 20% of them that experience half of all the problems on a weekend night. So that's saying basically 1 in 5 drinkers experiences 1 out of 2 of all the consequences. You want to reduce a problem on a campus, focus a lot on these individuals. All right, so that's the MRC group. So who are they and what do they do? And how do we change their behavior? Well, what we see most of the students don't drink that much, but they do. But they experience more than their fair share of problems. So they share the burden. They're more likely to have sexual assaults. They're more likely to have physical assaults. They're more likely to drink to a point where they can experience heavy drinking problems, actually even a little bit of signs of alcohol dependence. And we published this in 2014. We published other papers since on this group. And here's what we've learned. There are different parenting profiles out there. So just like we talked about student drinking profiles, there's different parenting groups. One group is what we call the positive pro-alcohol group. They do a lot of things really well, these parents. They communicate, they monitor, and they do really good jobs of communicating, modeling, and monitoring. But what they also do is they approve of their sons and daughters drinking when they're in college, especially underage drinking. So 17 and 18, 19-year-olds, all right? So they do a lot of really good things. They communicate, they model, they monitor, but they're a little bit like, well, it's okay. I've done it, there's other people done it, students are gonna do it, they're gonna do it. Then we have a positive anti-alcohol group. Oh, by the way, about 38% of the parents, almost 40% of the parents are in that positive group. They do a really good job of communicating, modeling, monitoring, and they let their kids drink. And they probably let their kids drink in high school as well, but they certainly let their kids drink early in college. Then we have the positive anti-alcohol group, and they make up 35% of the student parents too. They communicate just as well as that first group. They monitor just as well as that first group. They model just as well as that first group, but they say, look, you have your whole life ahead of you, and they discourage their kids from drinking alcohol when they're in college. Then we have negative mother, negative father. Negative mother means the mother has alcohol-related issues and also has communication issues. And the negative father in that home, that father has alcohol-related issues and alcohol communication issues. So really, we have 2 really positive groups of parents, and the only thing they differ on is one lets them drink and the other one discourages it. And then we have these 2 groups where there's some trouble going on in the family. And we publish these as well. So which profile is most likely to have kids that end up in the MRC group? Which group of parents? And this is, now we're getting to science, and these are odds. So we compared everybody with the positive group that doesn't let their kids or discourage them from drinking. And we found by having a mother who has alcohol-related issues and not very good communication, it's almost 2 times, it's almost 2 times higher to be in that MRC group. If it's negative father, it's almost 6 times higher to be in that group. But interestingly, the parents that communicate the best, model the best, and monitor their sons who are checking in, they're 4 times likely to be in that MRC group. They're almost at the same level as having fathers that have alcohol issues, and they're more than mothers that have alcohol issues. In other words, just communicating really well, just modeling really well, just modeling really well is not enough. It really has to do with a lot about the rules. So the parent handbook helps parents with these rules, and it helps them with the regulation. So which parent makes the best parent profile? Is it the positive pro-alcohol that wants to basically take the mystery away and help their kids understand the effects of alcohol by teaching them this? No, it's not. In other words, it has a counterintuitive effect. Even though parents might be trying to help their kids by taking the mystery away or by allowing them to feel the effects of alcohol at small doses under their control in their home when they're with them on special occasions. It doesn't have that benefit when they're with their friends at college. In fact, the opposite. It puts them 4 times more likely to be in the highest risk group of consequences. Negative mother? No. Negative father? No. Actually, the data show that the parents who communicate the best, who model the best, who monitor the best, and actively discourage their sons and daughters from drinking by allowing them to put it off, they do better. And these are interesting findings because we've looked at these not only here in the United States in our studies, but we've compared them to our colleagues in Europe and our colleagues in Australia, and we find the same exact issues. We find the same exact results. So it's no more safer to be to encourage your kid to drink, to take that mystery away. In fact, we think what it's doing is, in fact, it is taking the mystery away. So students are more likely to go to parties where there's high-risk behavior going on because the mystery's gone. They're no longer concerned about being in an environment where things can escalate much faster. Again, they don't have that experience because the high school parties and the college parties are simply not the same. We also noticed that we looked at this in relation to other substances. And we found that when we compare these 4 types of parenting profiles, that, and we looked at the outcome of combining alcohol with other drugs, and cannabis being the most commonly combined use in drug, that students experience 2.5 times more consequences when they combine alcohol with cannabis. And that the group that's most likely to combine alcohol with cannabis is not the positive anti-alcohol group, but rather the positive pro-alcohol group. And so let's take a step back and look at these data. Again, when we present these data to parents, we say, you know, we understand that you're trying to do something helpful here. You're trying to get them to have some experience. You're trying to teach them. It's just that we're not seeing this in our data. And we thought about, like, if parents change, does it matter? We've done those studies, and we found that if parents pump the brakes on letting their kids have alcohol, or hit the pause button, if you will, on that and say, well, try not to do that in your first year of college, we see that the number of risk and the consequence and the likelihood of being in an MRC group goes way down. In other words, it disrupts that increase. It disrupts that behavior. So it's not something they have to do forever, but in that first year, in the most high risk year, if you will, it seems to have a serious benefit that way. Okay, so summary. What works? Multiple well-controlled trials. Parents do make a difference to self-regulatory behavior, and drinking consequences are reduced and health outcomes are increased by simply reading these materials and having conversations. When I say simply, there's been a whole lot of work that's gone on by a lot of professionals that know what they're doing to make this that book. So I'm really happy and excited that TCU has joined and did this. And my experience is that we made a deal with TCU so that they're going to be doing this for several years. So congratulations to you, Alicia and Lindsay, for spearheading that for TCU. You deserve a medal. And with that, I want to acknowledge people, but I do want to leave time for people to ask me questions. I do have one more thing I want to do here. I want to mention this is one place to get information to me if parents are interested. And with that, I will take questions. I believe Alicia and Lindsay, you have potential questions for me.
We do. Thank you so much, Dr. Turrisi, for a wonderful presentation. And thank y'all TCU families just for your commitment to your students' success and taking the time to join us this evening. As Alicia mentioned, there at the bottom of your screen, you do have that Q&A that you can select. So please continue to submit questions, anything that you'd like to hear more about while we have our expert in-house with us. I didn't get the opportunity to introduce myself at the beginning, so I'll do it now. My name is Lindsay Tardif, and I am a substance use and recovery counselor in alcohol and drug education here on our campus. So I'm thrilled that we have access to Dr. Turrisi and his resources that we can now provide y'all with. So with that, I'm going to start diving into your questions. And one of the first ones that I have for you, Dr. Turrisi, is just how can a parent kind of get the ball rolling on this conversation? How do they open?
So that's a really good question. Thank you for asking me that. And I feel like I was supposed to probably talk about that earlier, but I mentioned that. First of it goes into in the parent materials that you'll be receiving. There's a whole section on initiating the conversation. I think what we try and encourage parents to do is ask their sons and daughters questions, and the questions that we encourage them to ask are start with how, what, and why, or what, how, and why. But start with those terms, and I'll give some examples of that. So I might want to talk to one of my kids or one of my students. So I'll say, there's a few things that for me, I'd like to know. So is it okay if asking permission really goes a long way? It shows mutual respect. Is it okay if we have a conversation about this and I ask you a few things? Is that all right? And if the student tells me, no, I got a lot going, I really don't want to talk about it now, I try and respect that instead of pushing it. They've told me this is not a really good time for them, and I'll say, okay, fine. I might roll back and I'll just say, just for me, for my own sake, it'll make me feel better if we can do that. So I'll ask you again, and I might wait a day, and then I'll turn around and I'll ask again. And if I get the same response of, oh, you're just going to lecture to me, I don't want to do this, can we not do this today? I'll say, look, I feel like I wouldn't be a good parent if I didn't get a chance to talk to you about this. So if now's not good, just like the other day, maybe you can share with me what would be good for you and find a time. Often, if you do that, if you just try and roll with that a little bit, you do that, oftentimes they'll say, all right, let's do this now. You obviously want to talk about this. And then what I say is, well, thank you, I appreciate it. What I really want to do is I just want to understand things. Honestly, things are different than when I was younger. It's been a while since I was a student on college campus. And so just kind of understand, what kind of things do you think are going to be going on when you get there? And I start with a what. And I'm not telling them what to do. I'm not lecturing to them. I'm not scolding them. I'm not starting off with, I hear that everybody's drinking on college these days. That's ridiculous. What do you think? I've already told them what I thought. So I just start with wanting to listen. So I say, what do you think will happen? And then they might tell me. I'll say, well, why do you think that? Just help me understand that. And I always want to go with the help me understand things. It's me. I want to know. I don't know. And then I might say, so what kind of things might you do if that happens? Or how might you handle that? What kind of things do you think will happen under these circumstances? And I think that idea of how, what, and why, first off, we found that it goes against the lecturing approach. It seems to be much more effective for getting kids to open up. And then you could follow up later on. You could say, so you've been at school for a week. How are things? We often say, how are things going? What have you been doing? What kind of things are going? How are your roommates? How's your money? How are you eating? What are you doing? So that kind of how, what, why questioning seems to be very effective for opening and breaking the ice. And again, I always try and put it out to me, like I want to be a good parent, and I feel like being a good parent, part of being a good parent is having a better understanding. If I understood more, I think I'd feel more comfortable. So I just want to ask some questions. Then the second thing is reacting to what you hear. And again, there's more in the handbook that talks about this, but it's important for you not to get, you're going to hear things. You ask the questions, how, what, and why, you're going to hear some answers to that you may be uncomfortable. And I would recommend that you model that not reacting to everything you hear. Take some time to process it. So if somebody says, well, it's going to be parties, it's going to be a lot of drinking, I'm going to be going to these parties. your immediate response shouldn't be, that's horrible. You know what's going to happen if that goes on. So I think part of it is just letting that process, recognizing that you're not going to necessarily react. Doesn't mean you're not going to react at some point, but at that moment, a reaction might just shut down the communication entirely. Whereas if you just go, all right, so you think that's going to go on, what are some things you might do if that goes on? Or how let's talk about your goals. What are some of the goals that you'd like to do when you're at college? And we talked about what you want to major. What would you like your GPA to look like? As a college professor, I ask students that walk in my office the same three things every single time. When somebody walks in my office, I always say, what is it you'd like to do with your life? I want to know what they're majoring in. I want to know what their career goals are. I want to know if they have any. So the first thing I say is, what do you want to do with your life? Second thing I ask is, tell me what your GPA is. Again, a what? What are you going to do with your life? What's your GPA? And I want to know what kind of student they are. And they tell me when they tell me what their GPA is. And then I'll go, okay. And I listen, and now I know what they want to do, and I know what their GPA is. Okay. And then I want to know, what do your parents do? What do your parents do for a living? Because I want to know where they got their work ethic from. So these are things that interest me as a college professor. And I've been doing this since 1984. So pretty much I've been asking every student that's ever showed up in my office. Anybody knows any of my students will know that. And I haven't asked adults. I asked colleagues. I've made them the first time say, hey, tell me what do you want to do with your science? What do you want to do with your career? What do you want to do? I don't ask them what their GPA is, but I want to know where their passion is. And at times, sometimes I will say, tell me a little bit about your parents. Because I want to know what gets passed on and where they get what the work ethic. For students, I feel very comfortable doing that. I think most parents should understand, what are your kids' goals? Oftentimes when we ask kids on the kid-based intervention, we ask them right away, what are your goals? What do you want to do? What do you expect to do? What do you expect to happen in your first semester or your second semester or your third year or whatever? And part of it is we're trying to understand their goals. Because I've heard many students tell me things like this. I want to be a blank. I'm going to college to help me get better at this. So now I know what their goals are. So then I can say, tell me a little about what you do as far as social behavior, drinking. Like, do you drink? Tell me a little about what your drinking might be on a weekend. And then I follow that up at some point with, how do you think that helps you meet your goals? So I'm trying to look at how they self-regulate. And parents could do that too. You could ask them, what do you expect to do on a weekend? How do you think that's going to help you with your goals? I would expect most students to say, it's not going to make a difference at all. Now, me being a professor, seeing this, I think it does make a difference, which is the reason why I want to help parents, which is the reason why we put these materials together. Does that help, Lindsay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool.
And I have another one here. So what is the best approach for a student who had one parent who's abused substances in the past, in terms of acknowledging the genetic predilection that addiction can have in families? So how would you approach a student in that situation? And how would you approach it so that the student feels like they can make an informed decision on their own, not just like, do this?
Okay, that's a lot of questions in there. So let's kind of unwrap it. Let's start with the family, the genetics, and stuff like that. So in our studies, we have had all types of families, and we've looked at all types of families in terms of parent drinking, and parent modeling, and role modeling, and things that go on. It's interesting. In most of our studies, one of the things we try and control for is how much parents drink. So we could see if parents behave in a certain way, will it matter independently of whether the parents have had heavy drinking or not. And this is not for an alcoholic parent that's currently alcoholic, that's engaged in this behavior, but we are looking at that in the work we've done. And I don't want to say it doesn't make a difference, but the things that we ask parents to do in terms of communication, modeling, and monitoring, Those things matter. And the rules that parents set for their kids, to whether they set rules that are discourage drinking, encourage drinking, and so on. And so, in other words, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It does. But communication, modeling, monitoring, and importantly, parental rule setting, they work independent as to how much the parents are drinking. So they work whether parents are drinking a little bit or a lot. So if you have parents that are engaged in it, and we have looked at both mothers and fathers in those risk profiles, it's interesting because oftentimes parents talk about one parent's one way and another parent's another way. So one parent says it's okay to drink and the other one discourages it. Interestingly, more parents are on the same page on that than are not. What we've done is, in some of our studies, we've asked the son or daughter, tell us about the parent that you feel does the most parenting for you. Like, which parent is your go-to parent on this issue? And they'll be upfront about that. And then we look at the profile of what that parent is like. And again, we have those 4 profiles. So the negative father and the negative mother in terms of drinking did put the kid at greater risk for being in that multiple repeated consequence group. So, but if the parent changes, then it makes it easier for the kid to change as well. So I think I kind of answered most of that, but I'm not 100% sure. Honestly, it does get complicated and really quickly, quite honestly. And some of these are hard and fast rules, some are not. But if a parent came to me and said, what could I do to really maximize lowering my kid's risk? I wouldn't ask about their drinking. That wouldn't be one of the things. I mean, if they said I drink, I have a problem, I'm drinking, clearly I can give them resources for referrals for help. But if they said, what can I do to help my kid the most? I would say, well, the data show that the rules that you said about encouraging or discouraging that are going to be very critical in this process. But communication does matter. Monitoring, checking in matters. And you're being a good role model matters. Those things do matter. But when I looked at the most recent studies we've done, setting rules seem to have the most impact. Did that help, Lindsay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. I appreciate everything you talked about, and I've learned so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Can I
you.
make a suggestion or a request?
Yes, you can.
Okay. First off, thank you for having me again. And now that we're going to be working together for 3 years, maybe have me back, but out in North Texas, all right?
Yes, we would love that.
Great. I wish you the best. Stay healthy, everybody, and have a great semester.
Thank you. Before we leave, I am going to provide everyone a link to the survey. If you could you please fill that out for me? For anyone that is looking for a recording, we do have your emails because you registered, so we will provide it with you from there. And the handbooks are not ready yet, but they should be ready very soon. We're just finishing up some touches with our logos and the colors. But also, when we get that, we can email it out to you and we'll give you more information about that later. So thank you again for everything. Please fill out that survey and you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.